So my name is Fenna Wolthuis. I'm a PhD student at the University of Groningen and currently almost done with the PhD. It focuses on how to organize lesson study in secondary education in the Netherlands. And today I'll be talking about one of my studies in which we looked at how lesson study is adapted by teachers in a Dutch context. So a little bit of background, it has been talked about already. Lesson study originates in Japan and has been spreading throughout the globe to different contexts. And if we look at what happens when lesson study is taken up outside of Japan, we often see that it's a short-lived initiative and it's frequently simplified as well if we compare it to how it's done in Japan. And the lesson study literature points to some specific problems that occur once lesson study is taken up outside of Japan. The first one we see is that there are some problems with understanding what lesson study really is. And Taima talked about this as well a little bit. The idea that lesson study is about designing a perfect lesson frequently occurs, and often this is seen as a misunderstanding. Second, this was also talked about very nicely in the first presentation, that the elements of lesson study are not always performed. So we think that lesson study is primarily a research process to investigate student learning, but instead we see that these elements that really define it as a research cycle are often left out. And lastly, there's also some evidence that lesson study is also not always evaluated positively. One frequently found criticism is that it's way too time-consuming for teachers, and they often complain about the amount of time it takes to really go through an entire research cycle. So with this in mind, we were very interested in examining how these different problems that we see kind of connect, and if we could make something out of that. So that is what we aim to investigate for this study. And we did that through the concept of organization routines. Organization routines are a concept from organization literature. They are a way to investigate how work in organizations is created, how it's maintained and developed. Usually work in organizations is done also through organization routines. And for example, in schools, that would be department meetings, which kind of organize the work. And as a concept, they are specifically useful when you look at the internal structure that they contain. The internal structure consists of an ostensive and a performative part. And the ostensive refers to kind of the abstract general script of a routine, kind of the steps that you have to follow. And then the performative refers to how that is actually performed by people. And then we added a focus on functionality as well, because we wanted to also capture that evaluation of lesson study. And in this case, that refers to how appropriate the design is considered to be. So for this study, we applied that to lesson study, and we were interested in examining these three elements and how they connected. So we looked at what teachers considered the purpose of lesson study to be. Then we also examined how they performed the lesson study research cycle. And lastly, we also investigated how they evaluated the suitability of lesson study for the purpose that they saw it had. And all the research questions are related to those three aspects. So we wanted to know how that kind of took shape. And this was the context that we looked at. My research focused for this study specifically on teachers. And the data was from a cross-school professional network, which took part for 4 years. And teachers from different schools, 21 in total that I interviewed, came from all different kinds of schools and came together in this network and engaged in lesson study, and in total performed 6 cycles. There were 2 professional learning networks, one for the math teachers and one for the Dutch language teachers. And so then after the 4 years, the professional learning network stopped, and the schools and the teachers could decide for themselves if and how they continued with lesson study. And that's when I came in and asked them about how they were performing lesson study. So that's what I did. I did that through semi-structured open-ended interviews, and the data analysis was done through a coding scheme, which was based on the concept of organization routines and functionality. So these are the results that we found. Firstly, what was striking is that there were 4 different patterns in what the perceived purpose of lesson study was amongst those 21 teachers. The first one was a group of teachers that considered the main purpose of lesson study to be lesson development. Another one was a group that focused specifically on the student responses, gaining insight into those as its main purpose. They were the third group who saw the main purpose of lesson study as gaining insight into student learning. And then there was one teacher who had a kind of an outlier purpose. She saw lesson study as a way to collaborate to create a shared vision. So these 4 patterns were found, and then we looked at how each group of teachers in these patterns performed the lesson study cycle. And what we found then was for the group that saw lesson study as lesson development, only 2 out of 6 teachers continued with lesson study in their own schools after the network ended. And when they did, they often shortened and simplified the research cycle. So what we got back was that the elements that focused on the planning of the lessons, they were kept, but the other elements were really abbreviated. So the discussion afterwards was much shorter, as well as setting up the research plan beforehand. And what we also found was, well, basically, to summarize, they've removed kind of the research elements. And what we also found was that the teachers in this group saw lesson study as too time-consuming for their perceived purpose as lesson planning. Then the second group, we looked at teachers who considered the purpose of lesson study to gain insight into student responses. Again, we saw that not a lot of teachers continued with lesson study in their own schools after the project ended, only 1. And this was a teacher who had done the full cycle as it was planned during the professional learning network, where we kind of used a model that really closely resembles the Japanese form. But she indicated quite quickly that she was planning to shorten and simplify the research cycle for her next cycle that she was planning. And all the teachers in this group also thought it was too time-consuming a practice to gain insight into student responses. Most of the teachers saw the main value as the specific research lesson, where they can really observe the students, and the lesson planning time discussion afterwards is less relevant and then too time consuming. And what was also interesting is that some teachers said that this insight was a once only insight, and once you gain it, you don't need to repeat the cycle, which also further constrained continuing with the practice. Then 11 teachers saw lesson study as gaining insight into student learning. This is a purpose that most closely, I think, resembles the purpose that lesson study was given during the professional learning network. And what was interesting to see is that from this group, 8 out of 11 continued with lesson study in their own schools. And most of them also continue to incorporate all of the different elements from the cycle and all the different steps that were involved in them. And when we looked at how these teachers evaluated lesson study, we also saw that teachers were very positive about the practice. They considered the time investment to be substantial, but worth it. They said that they gained a lot from the time they put in, and reasons that were given was that they really appreciated that they could focus on their own subject, that they could spend time on examining student learning. They were offered a way to collaborate with their other teachers, and also saw that there was a great practical relevance of the things they did during lesson study for their own teaching practice. So they were really very positive about lesson study. And then the last teacher, the kind of the outlier, who saw lesson study as a way to develop a shared vision. She had started with lesson study in her own school, but had stopped halfway through. And there were no plans to continue with lesson study beyond this. What she also told us regarding her evaluation was that she thought that maybe having a shared vision was more of a prerequisite for lesson study to go well than something that you could create with it. So in her case as well, the purpose of lesson study that she thought it had might not have suited its form. So 4 very different interpretations and 4 very different performances. And if we go to my conclusions and discussions, I think if I connect it to the previous presentations, what we see is that not only between cultures, there can be great variations in how lesson studies performed, but this also showed that even amongst teachers of the same culture, we saw quite some variations of how lesson study was performed, if it was performed at all, if they continued. So what we found was that there was this connection between how teachers perceive the purpose of lesson study, how they continue to perform it, and also how they evaluated it. And specifically, this notion of how teachers consider kind of the purpose of lesson study, what that is, was so important, it seemed, for how they continue to perform it. That might play a big role in whether or not teachers continue and sustain lesson study in their own schools. And we also found that the interpretation of lesson study as researching student learning was the most promising one. I also kind of went into the adaptations and fidelity argument for my article, but it was interesting to find that from a practical perspective, if you want to have a lesson study be useful for teachers and they feel like they gain something from it, then this fidelity might be the most useful as well. Because that was the only one where teachers were actually willing and enthusiastic to continue. So that's it from me. That's the end of the presentation. Oh yes, no, maybe a last question, because I was interested in, given the different ideas and purposes we found of lesson study, something to ponder for the future research is how come that teachers did have these different interpretations. So I'll leave you with that.